You paid $10 or $15 for that bottle of Tire Shine sitting in your garage. Maybe you upgraded to the fancy gel and spent more than that last month. And a couple of weeks later, your tires are faded again, maybe cracking at the edges, throwing streaks up the side of your car every time you take an on-ramp a little too fast. Here's a simple, cheap alternative that a lot of detailers and home mechanics have quietly used for years. A homemade rubber conditioner made from 3 or 4 kitchen cabinet ingredients. It costs about $1 a tire to make, it doesn't sling, and it actually conditions the rubber instead of just coating it. Let's talk about why store-bought Tire Shine behaves the way it does, what's actually in a good homemade mix, and how to apply it so it lasts. Most commercial tire dressings are silicone or petroleum-based. They work by coating the surface of the tire with a slick film that reflects light and looks wet and glossy. That film sits on top of the rubber. It doesn't bond to it. Over time, and especially at highway speed, that film can fling off as fine droplets. The sling that streaks up your quarter panels and, if left too long, can leave a hazy stain on paint that's genuinely hard to remove. Tires also have their own built-in protection. Tire rubber is manufactured with antioxidants and antioxidants blended into the compound specifically to fight UV and ozone damage. Over time, small amounts of these protective compounds migrate to the surface, sometimes called blooming. Repeatedly stripping the tire down with harsh solvent-based dressings and then recoating it with a temporary film isn't doing the rubber any favors. Letting the tire's own oils stay in place and topping them up with something that actually penetrates is a gentler approach. Instead of a coating, you can make a penetrating conditioner using ingredients that soak into the rubber rather than sit on top of it. Glycerin, food-grade vegetable glycerin, sold at any pharmacy, is a humectant. It draws and holds moisture in the rubber rather than stripping it out, the way solvent-based products do. Castor oil is a heavier oil that helps fill in the microscopic pores of the rubber surface, giving a deeper, more saturated black look. Distilled water thins the mix slightly so it spreads evenly. Use distilled rather than tap water. Tap water minerals can leave faint white spots as they dry. Beeswax, optional but useful, can be melted in to form a very thin, breathable seal on the surface once the mix has soaked in. It helps the conditioning stay in place through rain and car washes instead of washing straight off. A basic ratio that works well. Half a cup of glycerin, a quarter cup of castor oil, and a quarter cup of distilled water. Shaken together until it looks like coffee with cream. If you want to add beeswax, warm the mixture gently in a bowl of hot water, not on a stovetop flame. Then stir in about a teaspoon of shaved beeswax per cup of mixture and shake until it's fully incorporated. Total ingredient cost for a batch that will last many applications is typically under $15. And a single batch can cover a set of tires many times over. Call it roughly $1 or so per tire per application, depending on where you buy the ingredients. This step matters more than people expect. Scrub each tire with a stiff brush and warm soapy water until the rinse water runs clear. If there's a grayish film on the rubber, old dressing residue and oxidized rubber, scrub it off. The conditioner needs clean rubber to soak into, 10 to 15 minutes in the sun, a bit longer in the shade. Not a synthetic applicator. Cotton absorbs and releases the mixture more evenly. Dip a corner of the rag into the jar, wring out the excess so it's damp rather than dripping, and work it into the sidewall in overlapping strokes from the top of the tire down toward the tread. Avoid pushing the mix into the tread grooves themselves before wiping. This is the step people most often skip, and it's the one that actually matters. The oils need time to penetrate before you buff. Driving on it immediately or wiping it down right away undercuts the whole point of the method. This removes the surface excess and leaves a matte to satin black finish that sits inside the rubber rather than on top of it. 2 applications, about a week apart, tend to give the best initial result, driving the conditioner in more deeply. After that, once a month is usually plenty for a daily driver, though how long it lasts will depend on your climate, how often you wash the car, and how many miles you're putting on. This isn't a miracle cure, and it won't outperform every commercial product in every situation. Some silicone dressings genuinely do give a glossier, wetter-looking shine, and they're faster to apply. What a glycerin and oil-based conditioner tends to do well is avoid the sling problem, since it isn't sitting as a loose film on the surface, and it can be gentler on the rubber over repeated use than stripping and recoating with solvents every couple of weeks. If you want a side-by-side comparison, that's an easy test to run yourself. Treat one tire with the homemade mix, leave the others as they are, and check back in a few weeks to see how each is holding up. Total cost for the ingredients is low. The time investment is about 10 to 15 minutes per tire, including the wait time, and it's something you can make and use with things you likely already have around the house: a bucket, an old cotton rag, and a mason jar. If you try it, it's worth keeping notes on what works for your climate and driving conditions, since results can vary more with a homemade formula than with a commercial one that's been tuned in a lab. It helps to understand what job each ingredient is actually doing, so you can adjust the mix if your results aren't quite right. Glycerin is the workhorse of the formula. Chemically, it's a humectant. meaning it attracts and holds onto water molecules. When it's worked into rubber, it helps keep the material from drying out the way it would under repeated sun exposure or repeated stripping with harsher cleaners. It's also inexpensive and widely available. Most pharmacies carry it near the skincare section, since it's a common ingredient in lotions for the same moisture-retaining reason. Castor oil is thicker and heavier than glycerin, and it's the ingredient mainly responsible for depth of color. Rubber that looks washed out or grayish usually has a slightly porous, light-scattering surface. A heavier oil like castor oil fills those pores in and helps light reflect more evenly, which reads visually as a deeper, richer black. It's worth using cold-pressed castor oil rather than a highly refined version, mainly because cold-pressed oils tend to have fewer additives. Distilled water is there purely for consistency, not for any conditioning effect of its own. Tap water carries dissolved minerals, calcium, magnesium, and so on, that can leave faint white mineral deposits as the water evaporates off the tire, similar to hard water spots on a windshield. Distilled water avoids that problem entirely. Beeswax, if you choose to add it, is the ingredient that affects longevity more than any other. On its own, a glycerin and oil mix will condition the rubber, but can still be somewhat vulnerable to washing off in rain or at the car wash, since it hasn't fully cured into the surface. A thin beeswax layer, applied correctly, adds a semi-permeable barrier. It's not airtight or waterproof in the way a silicone coating is, but it does slow down how quickly the conditioning oils rinse away, which is part of why a beeswax finished batch tends to hold up for closer to a month than a week or two. If the finish looks streaky after buffing, it's usually one of two things. Either the tire wasn't fully cleaned before application, so the mixture is sitting unevenly over patches of old residue, or too much product was applied, and there wasn't enough buffing afterward to even it out. The fix in both cases is the same. Re-clean the tire and use less product on the next pass, applying in thin, even coats rather than one heavy one. If the color looks dull rather than deep black, that's often a sign the mixture needs a slightly higher ratio of castor oil, or that the 15-minute penetration window is skipped. Buffing too soon, before the oil has actually soaked in, tends to leave a flatter finish. If you notice any mild residue rubbing off onto your hands, or a light cloth after the tire has fully dried, you've likely applied more product than the rubber can absorb. A lighter application, buffed more thoroughly, usually resolves this on the next round. Warm weather, roughly room temperature to the mid-70s Fahrenheit, tends to help the oils penetrate more readily, since heat lowers viscosity slightly. In colder weather, the mixture will be thicker and slower to absorb. Warming the jar briefly in a bowl of warm water before application can help, the same way you'd warm the beeswax-infused version. In climates with frequent rain or heavy road salt in winter, you may find the conditioning doesn't last quite as long between applications, simply because more of it is being rinsed away by weather and by more frequent car washing. In that case, applying every 2 to 3 weeks rather than monthly during the wetter season is reasonable. A typical batch: half a cup of glycerin, a quarter cup of castor oil, a quarter cup of distilled water, and a small amount of beeswax if you're using it, costs somewhere in the range of $10 to $15 in ingredients, most of which is a one-time purchase, since a little goes a long way. Glycerin and castor oil are typically sold in bottles far larger than a single batch requires, so one purchase can realistically cover many months of use. Beeswax, similarly, is usually sold in blocks or pellets that will last a long time at a teaspoon or tablespoon per batch. In terms of time, cleaning and drying the tires takes the bulk of the effort, maybe 10 to 15 minutes total for a full set. Application itself is quick, a couple of minutes per tire, but the 15-minute wait before buffing is where most of the total time goes. All told, budget about 45 minutes to an hour for a full set of 4 tires if you're doing it properly, including the cleaning step. That's a reasonable trade-off for something you'd only need to repeat every few weeks, rather than every few days, and it avoids the sling and paint staining issues that come with some solvent-based sprays. Keep the finished mixture in a glass jar with a tight-fitting lid rather than a plastic container. Castor oil can interact with certain plastics over long periods, gradually changing the texture of the mix. So glass is the safer choice for anything you plan to store for more than a few weeks. Kept in a cool, dark place, a garage shelf or a cabinet away from direct sunlight, a batch without beeswax will generally stay usable for several months. If you've added beeswax, give the jar a good shake before each use, since the wax can settle out slightly over time, especially in a cooler space. A quick warm water bath before applying will bring it back to an even consistency. It's worth labeling the jar with the date you mixed it, just as a simple way to keep track of how old the batch is. If you ever notice an off smell, a change in color, or separation that doesn't recombine with shaking, it's a sign the batch has gone past its useful life, and it's time to mix a fresh one. The ingredients are inexpensive enough that there's little reason to keep using a batch you're unsure about. While a rag, a bucket, and a jar are really all you need, a few small additions can make the process smoother if you plan to do this regularly. A dedicated applicator pad kept just for this purpose, rather than reused from other cleaning products, avoids cross-contamination with residues from other chemicals. A small funnel makes it easier to pour the mixture back into a narrow-necked jar without spilling. And if you're treating more than one vehicle, mixing a slightly larger batch at once, then dividing it into a couple of smaller jars can save you from having to remix as often. Some people also find it useful to keep a second, smaller jar just for the beeswax added version, since it needs to be warmed before each use, while a plain glycerin and castor oil batch can be applied straight from a cooler jar without any prep. Splitting the two lets you choose a quicker no-wax application on a weekday and a slower, longer-lasting beeswax application on a weekend when you have more time. It's reasonable to expect gradual cumulative improvement in how the rubber looks and feels over repeated applications, rather than an overnight transformation. Tires that have been treated for months or years with solvent-based dressings may take a couple of cleaning and conditioning cycles before the underlying rubber starts to show the deeper, more even black that this method aims for. That's a normal part of the process, rather than a sign that something's wrong. The first application is mostly about removing old residue and rehydrating rubber that's been chemically stripped for a while, and later applications build on that foundation.